integumentary system, we're talking about the outer coverings of the patient or the animal. And in this case, obviously, skin is a big part of that. But skin is not just skin. There are different layers to skin. There is the epidermis, which is what? It sits on the dermis, because it's epidermis, okay? Epidermis has no blood supply. None, okay? That's why it dies. The further it gets away from the dermis, it starts to die, and it flakes off. And you have dandruff, or then you have all sorts of little white spots, okay? The dermis is the thickest portion of the skin, okay? The epidermis is relatively thin. There's different kinds of epidermis. Deep to the dermis, we have the hypodermis. And that's got a lot of fat in it, okay? A lot of areolar connective tissue. A lot of people call it the subcutaneous tissue, okay? But there's also in the skin a lot of accessory organs. There are glands in there that are sweat glands. They could be sebaceous glands, and in females, mammary glands. But then there are other things out there. For example, hair or feathers, depending on the species, claws, hooves, beaks, scales, horns, and antlers only because they're on the outside. Technically, they're not. Antlers are bone, okay? Whereas horns are not bone, okay? We'll get to that in a while. If we look at the integument or skin to start, its primary function is to protect us, protect the animal from physical trauma or invasion from something from the outside. It could be physical invasion, it could be chemical invasion, it could be bacterial invasion, whatever. It's to help keep it from getting into us. So the skin is meant to keep things out. So that means when you put something on your skin, it usually doesn't go into your body, which is good, unless you want it to go into the body. Then you got to deal with getting it in past that barrier. The skin is also to make sure we maintain our hydration. Could you imagine if your skin was not water impermeable? You're all sitting here, slowly dehydrating through the skin. And you just dry up and you look like a prune, okay? But your skin keeps that fluid in there. Unless you're a fish. Now what? It keeps it from getting in, not out. You don't want more water getting into the fish, because if it does, the fish blows up. Okay? And it's also a really good barrier to radiation. Now, that depends on the pigment of the animal, or person for that matter. People that are very, very white, they don't have much protection. Anybody that's really white, good out in the sun, what happens to you? You get sunburned. Holy crap, and it hurts. But if you've got some skin pigmentation, then you're protected to a higher level than those that don't. Same thing with animals. Okay? For example, white cats. Anybody ever looked at a white cat's ear tips in the summertime? They're usually sunburned, big time. And then that usually can turn into squamous cell carcinoma. Then you have to amputate their ears, if they survive. Okay? All right. Skin has also functions of sensation. We talked about that when we talked about the sensations. Okay? There's nerve cells that go out there, nerve endings that go out there that help us to know what the temperature is, what pressure is, or what we touched. And then pain receptors are in the skin. We've already mentioned all that. Then there's also those accessory organs, the sweat glands, and sebum, or the oily glands that secrete an oil-like substance. And then also there are pheromones out there. pheromones are really important for specific species, and letting their comrades know what's going on. Like, is it time for breeding season? Things like that. Now, skin is also really important in the production of vitamin D in the body. Okay? Sunlight has to hit it, it's converted so that vitamin D is now in the body so that you can absorb. Why is it so important? Why is vitamin D that big a deal? You guys had physiology, right? You can't absorb calcium without vitamin D. Okay? And vitamin D is also extremely important for your immune system. How many people think there's a cold and flu season? Is there?
There's a dark season.
Why?
Because there's less sunlight, so
Why?
less vitamin D to...
Why? Why is there less sunlight?
Because it's darker.
It's way over there. It goes to South America. Because their summer is our winter, right? So the sun now changes because the Earth's on an axis that tilts. So there's no cold and flu season. There's just a less vitamin D3 season because we're not exposed to sunlight as much. We're really lucky here because we're below the 35th parallel, which means that we have usually pretty good sunlight. So if you look at cold and flu season, where is it a bigger problem? North of the 35th parallel. You ever noticed people in Chicago get sick a lot more than we do? Because they don't have as much vitamin D. Should be a hint to everybody. Oh. And then we obviously have the possibility or the need for thermal regulation. The surface area of the animal has a lot more to do with thermal regulation than anything else. For example, elephant, mouse. Which one has more surface area? The mouse. Okay? Because it has to do with relative to body weight. So who's going to get cold faster? The mouse or the elephant? The mouse, because the mouse has got more surface area. When you look at it relative to the weight of the animal, that's how you calculate it. Okay? So the mouse's surface area is so much greater than that elephant. When you're looking at relative to body weight, that mouse is going to get cold super fast. Whereas the elephant, he's going to stand, he can tolerate walking around in the wintertime. He's not going to tolerate it. Because he's got all that body mass. Everybody understand that? So, surface area is really important when it comes to thermal regulation. The more surface area they have relative to body weight, they're not going to be able to stay warm nearly as much. Obviously, part of that is the accessory organs as well, and sweat. Why is sweat important? Because when water evaporates, it takes heat with it. And so you get cooled off. So animals that don't sweat, like dogs and cats, they can't cool their body temperature down. But horses, on the other hand, sweat like crazy when they get hot. And so that helps cool their entire body down. And then the protective apparatus, the hair coat. Hair coat is not just to keep you warm. It's to keep you cool as well. I have a real hard time when people start shaving their dogs in the summertime to keep them cool. Because now they're making it worse. That hair coat is to help insulate them from the outside temperature. And that's what insulation does, right? When you insulate a house, do you have to warm your house as much in the wintertime? No, because it's insulated. How about cool it in the summertime? Not as much, because it's insulated. That's what hair coat does. And then obviously, skin is important for communication. Okay? The hackles stand up on the back of the dog, or their ears stick up. The subcutaneous tissue is important for attaching the skin to the underlying muscle bands or fascial layers. And that's where there's a lot of fat stored, okay? When you move the skin of a dog, a real fat dog, the skin moves, but there's a big layer of fat underneath it, okay? So that's a good place for storage for energy, if needed. Skin is then considered the largest organ of the body, okay? It's the external surface, but the external surface, the part that's on the outside, is dead. So all of this stuff that's on us is dead stuff, okay? And it becomes keratinized. Keratinized means that there's a specific type of protein that makes it really tough, okay? Now, when the skin that's keratinized gets really close to where it's got to change to a mucous membrane, that keratinization just changes, and it's no longer keratinized. Now it's just moist tissue. And that would be the area around where it becomes the mouth, or the eyes, or into the nose, back in the anal area, or where the ureter is, okay? That keratinized skin has to change. If we look at skin, there's different kinds of skin out there based on how thick it is. If it's really thick skin on an animal, it's generally going to be someplace like the nose or the foot pads, because it takes a lot more trauma there. But if you look at the skin of the abdomen, it's really, really thin, okay? Or the scrotum of a dog, it's really thin skin, okay? If we look at that microscopically, we can see the big difference. This is thin skin, and that little layer right there is the epidermis. This is thick skin. Look at the difference that you can see just in the epidermal layer. And the dermal layer is also going to be different. It's going to be very interdigitating in places where it's really potentially going to have a lot of trauma. The accessory organs in that skin include the sweat glands. Sweat glands are down inside. They usually lie next to a hair follicle someplace, okay? Or this has a little duct that goes right to the skin and releases the water or the sweat. Sebaceous glands is the oily stuff. They're around hair follicles as well. They secrete that oily stuff out onto the hair, and that helps to increase water impermeability or water resistance. And then mammary glands. Those are obviously in the areas where mammary glands are found, and that's all they are, is modified sweat glands. That they are going to produce not just the milk, but also pieces of the cells. The protective structures are the hair. Hair is very protective for heat and cold. But then you've got things like the claws or hooves of a horse or a cow or whatever, okay? So let's start with the epidermis. Remember, the epidermis is avascular. There is no blood supply to the epidermis. So from here, this layer right here, all the way to here, there's no blood supply. So that means the only cells that are getting blood are the ones right next to the dermis here. And the blood cells, or the blood can get there and give them the nutrition that they need. And so what do those cells do? What do cells do? Huh? They divide. Because they're alive, right? So these cells are going to be dividing. Well, then where do they go? They start moving out. And the further they move out, what happens to them? They die. By the time they get up here, they fall off. Okay? The keratinization process happens in here, and that's what gives that skin its strength. Now, stratified squamous epithelium, okay, means that there is multiple layers that are flat. Okay? In the stratified squamous epithelium, there are different layers, okay? The first layer is the stratum basale. The stratum basale, or the basal layer, are the cells that are still alive. And they're getting their blood supply or the nutrition from the dermis down here. Okay? So those are the cells that are dividing. That's also the place where melanocytes are found, the cells that are pigmented. And it's also where you can find Merkel discs, part of the sensation stuff that we talked about. It's the sensory lectures. After we get past the stratum basale, the next layer is the stratum spinosum. Well, the reason they call that spinosum is because when you prepare these slides to look at under a microscope, they kind of dry out. When they dry out, the cell attachments from this cell to this cell are kind of left hanging on, okay? But the rest of the cell shrinks. So you start looking and you can see little lines between the cells, little spines. You can't see that in cells that have not been prepared for looking at under a microscope. But under a microscope you can see it. So, stratum basale, then you can start seeing the little spines or the little bridges, the desmosomes between the cells that help hold them together. And then inside there are Langerhans cells as well. Okay, I don't know who Langerhans was, I don't care. Then, once we get past the stratum spinosum, we get into the stratum granulosum layer. And this is where all of a sudden we start seeing glycolipids being formed. And what would glycolipids be for? The cells are dead, so it can't be used for anything. Water. They resist water penetration, so it's one of the things that's going to help prevent things from getting in to our bodies, okay? Keratohyalin, or the keratin, now starts to be formed in this layer here, okay? That's where we get that resilience, or that armor, if you will. All of the organelles now are starting to be gone. You can't see the nucleus anymore. You can't see all of the things that keep that cell alive because they don't have any blood supply, okay? Then, after that, in thick skin, then you get this area called the stratum lucidum, or the lucid layer. It's clear, kind of transparent. In thin skin, you don't see that layer, okay? But if it's real thick, like on the end of the nose or the bottom of the foot pad, you'll find it. After the stratum lucidum, the stratum corneum. This is the cornified tissue, the keratinized tissue, the flat cells. That's the thickest layer of the skin, okay? And then again, that's what gives us our protection. But also, the closer and closer it gets to the outside environment, it's dead, and so they fall off. Anybody ever had a grandma or grandpa that passed away and you went in to clean up their house after they passed away? Anybody ever done that? You ever taken the sheet off their bed?
I was too young to.
Oh, so you didn't do it?
No, my older siblings did that part.
They probably didn't tell you about taking the sheet off the bed and seeing all the dead skin cells that are on the mattress. You know how they have the buttons in them? Those usually are filled up with dead skin cells. Kind of weird when you start thinking about it. But that's happening to you guys all the time. Skin cells are always falling off. On the dogs and the cats, skin cells are always falling off. Okay? Now, the next layer is the dermis. The dermis is the thickest part of the skin. But this is what gives us the strength. So here's that little epidermis, and this is thin skin, obviously. That's not very, I mean, you wouldn't even be able to see how thick that is if you were to make an incision in your hand, okay? But the dermis is really thick, okay? It has the papillary layer. The papillary layer has little extensions that go up inside the dermis, or the epidermis. If it's really thick skin and potentially more susceptible to impact or trauma, those interdigitations are going to be really extensive. And that interdigitation is what helps hold the epidermis onto the dermis and keeps them attached. Okay? Inside that epidermis, we have more myxoid corpuscles, the sensation things we talked about in the sensory lecture. But that's also where the blood vessel loops come up. They come up, they get up inside there, and that gives blood supply to some of the cells at the basal layer of the epidermis. Okay? Then, after we get through that layer, we get into the next layer, the collagen layer. So we have papillary layer here, and then we have the reticular layer. And all of that basically is collagen. Okay? Now, this is essentially this. That's what leather belts and shoes are, is this layer here, not this. You ever seen anybody make leather? How they do it? They have to scrape off all the sub-Q tissue, then they have to scrape off the outer layer, okay, to get down to the leather portion. Okay, so that's all collagen. Collagen is produced by cells, and you guys remember this, we talked about it at the first of the semester, last year, okay? The cells are fibroblasts. The fibroblasts create the collagen. Collagen is secreted, and that's what gives cells its strength. Also in here, there are tissue macrophages, just kind of sitting there waiting for something to come in that's not supposed to be there. And if it gets in there, then those macrophages can start to phagocytize it. Lots of blood vessels in here. Here we can see arteries and veins here. There's an artery there, there's a vein right there. There's glands up inside that layers, the sweat glands, the sebaceous glands are down in the dermis itself. And the hair follicles. They're not up here. Hair follicles have to be down here because hair grows. If hair grows, that means it has to be alive. It has to have blood supply. And then there's smooth muscle down in this area. Especially in dogs, you see it a lot when their hair stands up on end. And that's the smooth muscle or the erector pili muscle that causes the hair to stand up. Then we get to the hypodermis, or the subcutaneous tissue. The subcutaneous tissue is a lot of that connective tissue that holds the dermis down to the muscle layers, or to the fascial layers below the sub-Q. A lot of elastic fibers that can stretch, okay, and then go back into their original shape. Then there's fat, there's lots of blood vessels down in there, and nerves down in this layer are the Pacinian corpuscles, or those big pressure receptors that we talked about. If we look at thick skin, okay, it's going to be a little bit different. It's usually going to be pigmented, okay, like on this nose, okay. There's a lot of melanocytes in there, in the stratum basale layer, okay. This would be the stratum basale layer in a pigmented nose. And then look at the papillary layer here. See how it goes up and down and up and down and up and down? That's because it's more prone to be damaged by trauma or be disturbed, so it's got to be able to interdigitate more to make sure that it stays there, right? Foot pads are also thick skin. Now, when it comes to foot pads, okay, you got to know which foot pad you're looking at. Okay, so you have to be able to identify it. Obviously, it's thick skin for protection. Deep to that foot pad, there's a little area of dense fat to act as a cushion. When we're looking at foot pads, we have foreleg, and you guys can tell which is foreleg, right, by looking? Which one's the foreleg? This one. Why? Because it's got a dew clot. Okay? This is a rear leg. You've got to be able to tell me which foot pad it is, which means you ought to know which leg it is. So you're going to say something pad of right front leg or left front leg. Okay? The digital pads, obviously, are on the toes. The bone that is just deep to that is, in the dog,
The digits.
huh?
Digits?
Which bone? Not digit, bone. Which one? You guys have skeletal.
What was the question?
How many digital bones are there? 3. Okay? So digital pad, the third one is there. But there's a little bit of 2 there as well. But if you're a cat, which one is it? You don't have 4. You have 3. Cat front legs, the claw, the P3 retracts clear back. So it's 2 for a cat. Okay? Once we get past digital pads, then we have the metacarpal or metatarsal pad, the big one that they walk on. Okay, that carries most of the weight. Obviously, if I say left metatarsal pad, what am I also saying? Rear lip, because it says metatarsal. If I say metacarpal, that means it's a front leg. But if I say digital, now you have to tell me front or back. Okay? Now, the carpal pad is way up here. Notice this doesn't have that. So that's the other way to know that this is front leg, this is back leg. The carpal pad is also called the stopper pad. And if you've ever watched a dog, or even a horse for that matter, run, when they hit the ground, that leg goes all the way down and the carpus will actually touch the ground. Okay? But it shouldn't go any further than that, so that's why they call that the stopper pad. Okay? Now, when we look at these, they have specific numbers that go along with the digital or the bones we talked about before. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay? On this one, which one's lateral? Which one's medial? Is this 2 or is this 2? Because 1's not there. So which one's which?
That's the.
The way the tendons.
Like it looks like that.
This part here?
Yeah.
This part here comes up and attaches right there, which is what?
Attaches to is the
No.
Achilles tendon?
It's the Achilles tendon, the Achilles bone. The calcaneus is right there. No, yeah, calcaneus is right there. So this is, calcaneus is on the lateral side, so this is lateral. Make sense? Okay. But that's different in the horse. Because a horse has a hoof. They don't have toes that touch the ground. They do walk on 3. When a horse walks around, it's like they're walking right there. And we learned that before, right? So the third digit, okay, is what they're walking around on. But 2 and 4 are still there, but they're just remnants of that. The remnants of that are way down there, and they're called the ergot, okay? They're just tiny little callus-like things that are there. That's the only thing we can see there, the pad remnants for digits 2 and 4. Well, they're walking on 3, remember? So 2 and 4 are going to be up here.
So is the frog walking?
We're not there yet. Okay? So we're talking everything above the hoof. Now, when you get way up there, you're going to see that thing. Okay? That is the pad remnant for the carpal pad or the tarsal pad. Okay? Because what's this bone area right here? What's this area right there? If you're a horse person, that's the knee. What's that if in real life? That's the carpus. So that's the remnant of the carpal pad. There's also one of those back here. You can kind of see it right there. Okay? So that's just the remnants of those pads, or where those pads would have been in the horse. Everybody see it? All right. Now let's look at some glands. First one we're going to look at are the sweat glands. Sweat glands are considered apocrine glands. Okay? The apocrine gland means that they're just going to excrete the fluid out of there into a little pocket or out onto the skin. Apocrine glands empty into hair follicles, so water can come out of the hair follicles. Eccrine glands, those that are just secreting the water itself and no parts of the cell, they are secreting right out onto the skin surface. Okay? So apocrine sweat glands empty into the hair follicle. Eccrine sweat glands empty right out onto the surface of the skin. And again, their primary purpose is to release water so that the water can be evaporated, which helps cool the animal down. Now, not all of them are the same, because the skin and the hair follicles are different depending on the species. Okay? Now, there's sebaceous glands in there, and they secrete sebum, which is the oily stuff that helps to give a water resistance type of a structure. They are around the tails. The tail glands are really big, especially in dogs. You can actually feel them, and there's a lot of them right there. The circumanal glands go around the anus itself. It helps to secrete sebum at the terminal aspect of the anus to keep that skin moist and protected. Then there's anal secretions or anal glands. Okay, we'll get to that later. There are circumoral glands around the mouth that secrete that oily stuff. Okay? Ceruminous glands are the ones that secrete the oily stuff in your ears or earwax. And then there's meibomian glands. And the meibomian glands are in the eyelids. And they secrete an oily-like material so that the tears that your tear glands produce are now covered with a light oily film. It helps prevent them from drying out so much. Okay? What is one of the other reasons you could see this then for? These glands, this oily secretion, based on what we're seeing here. What happens to oil when it sits out for a long time? Huh?
It's hard.
Oil?
Oh, that's perfect.
No, it doesn't. Still oil, but it starts to stink. Starts to smell funny, right? There's lots of pheromones and it starts to smell funny. Anybody ever see a cat come up and rub their face on you? That's not because they love you. They're marking you. They're putting their scent all over you. They don't love you. Give me a break. All they're trying to do is put their scent all over you. So then they know who's boss. Okay? All right, mammary glands. We've already talked about mammary glands. They're modified sweat glands to produce milk. We talked about the production of milk in the alveolar portion. Gets into the duct, goes through the ducts, and then it's going to be secreted through the street canal. Any questions about the glands? All right, now let's talk about hair. Hair comes from a follicle. Hair grows, right? That means it has to have blood supply someplace. Well, the hair follicle is way down in the dermis. The hair follicle has a little peg or a papilla that goes up inside of it, and a blood vessel goes up in there. So all of the cells that are part of the basal layer are real close to here. And so those cells are constantly dividing. And as they continue to divide, the hair grows out the shaft or out the follicle. Okay, so that's how that works out. The cells are keratinized. They're a lot harder than just regular skin. Okay? But by the time it gets out here, it's dead. Okay? That's why you can get a haircut and it doesn't hurt. The dermal papilla, or the part that goes up inside there, has nerve and blood in there. If you pull a hair out, what does it do? It hurts. Unless that dermal papilla has receded away and the hair is getting ready to fall out or shed. And then it just kind of falls out. Okay? Now, there's also smooth muscle. We talked about that. The erector pili muscle is right there. Okay? And when that contracts, it pulls that hair follicle this way and the hair will stand up. Okay? That's how hair stands up on end. And then obviously inside that follicle, we talked about the sebaceous and apricot sweat glands. They empty into that follicle somewhere way up in here, okay? Or way up in this direction. That's where the sweat glands or the sebaceous glands will empty into. Now, there's different kinds of hair out there. When we look at hairs, we can look at primary hairs or guard hairs. These are the outer coat or the primary protective layer, the really long, thick hair. There's generally one guard hair or primary hair for every follicle. Okay? Then we look at wool hairs. These are the secondary hairs. This is the undercoat. They're usually kind of short and a little bit softer than the long guard hairs are. And there can be multiple follicle or hair shafts coming out of each follicle with guard hairs. Now, the other kind of hair are the tactile hairs, the whiskers. Okay? These are the vibrissae. They have really big hypodermal follicles, big ones. Big blood sinuses inside there and a lot of nerve endings. And the reason for that is when that hair moves, it moves the blood in the little chamber, and that stimulates the nerves so that they can tell what's going on. That's why cutting the whiskers off is really not the best idea to do, because that's how they can sense things. You would never do that to a rat or something that has to rely on those to get around. Okay? Now, all of those kinds of hairs grow differently depending on the kind of animal you're looking at. If we're looking at compound hair growth, they're the ones that have multiple hairs coming out through the follicles, okay? They can be guard hairs, but they can also have wool hair, or the secondary. So dogs and cats have compound hair growth, unless it's a Sphinx cat. They have that, because if you get that nice smooth layer on the surface and look underneath it, there's more hairs under there, right? Some of them have even bigger amounts of those wool hairs, like Labradors. And it's really tough to shave that hair, because once you get down into that guard hair, there's a lot of it to cut. Horses, on the other hand, and cows, only have simple hair growth. They only have guard hairs. So if you move the hair around on a horse, you're not going to see any wool hairs. Okay? Now, obviously, when they are getting ready for winter growth, their guard hairs change. Okay? And that gets us to this point of losing hair. Okay? There are 3 cycles of hair growth. The first one is called anagen. Anagen means that they're constantly growing. Okay? There's a big dermal papilla, there's blood vessel inside there and a nerve inside there, and it's really fat down here. If you pull this hair out, it hurts. Okay? Then it goes into the transition phase. It's going from active growth to where it's not really growing much anymore. The blood vessel or the dermal papilla is getting smaller. The blood vessel is going to pull out. And then once it's completely gone, you go into the telogen phase. Now it's almost everted. Goes the other way. Pulling this out doesn't really hurt. It just kind of slides out. Okay? This process of growth to telogen and falling out is the shed cycle. And this is a cyclic process. It goes on depending on the season. The day and night cycles, which then goes back to which system or which organ in the body to help us figure that out. Central nervous system, we talked about it. We also talked about it in endocrine. The pineal gland, okay, has a lot to do with those cycles. Temperature, environment, and then hormonal influence. This is what can happen if there's an excessive amount of certain hormones at a certain time of year, okay? They can get a condition called telogen effluvium. What's telogen again? This phase. The hair is not active, it's not growing or anything, but all the hair falls out. You ever seen a human female that has telogen effluvium during pregnancy or after? They go bald. It's very interesting to watch. Dogs and cats, that same thing can happen. Okay? Any question about hair? All right, now let's get into claws. When we look at claws, claws surround in dogs and cats, they surround the ungual process of P3. So remember when we were doing bones, and then we looked at P3, the part that went out inside where the claw was is the ungual process. Everybody remember that? The ungual process is surrounded by vascular tissue and nervous tissue called the corium. The corium is also called in lay terms the quick. Okay? So if you cut it, it bleeds. If you cut it, it can hurt because there's nerves in there. But the corium surrounds the ungual process of P3. Everybody got it? Okay? Now, if we look at the claw itself, it's got different parts. The first part is called the unguis. Okay? The unguis starts way up in here. Okay? Right there, and those are the germinal cells that produce the claw cells. Okay? Or the tissue that creates the claw. This is the unguis itself, or the wall. And again, it comes from the coronary bed or band. It's usually on the lateral aspects, and dorsal if you look at dorsal. But if you look underneath, it looks different. The claw cells are very highly keratinized. Highly keratinized. That's what makes them hard. The sole is the part that's down underneath. So if you look at this cut toenail, this is the unguis. This is the sole. And it's softer. Okay? It's ventrally positioned. Everybody see how the toenail is, or the claw is. You can look at your own hands and it's exactly the same thing. But for us, it doesn't wrap all the way around P3. It's just on the dorsal aspect of our fingers or our toes. Okay? But all of the rest of it, the coronary band or the cells that create the keratinized cell is still in the same location. Okay? And if you've ever looked on the side of your fingers, anybody ever have what's called a hangnail? That little thing that comes out, it's really soft. It's not the same as the stuff on top, right? And when you pull it out, then you get it hurts, it bleeds, might get infected. That's the sole. And on us, there's one on each side. Okay? Lots of different kinds of claws out there. From really expansive, long claws to digging type claws to little toenails on a cat or fingernails. Okay? Lots of different kinds of claws. All of them are adapted to have specific purposes based on what the animal is. Okay? That brings us to hooves. Okay? Completely analogous to fingernails and claws. But now they're only on hoofed animals. The anatomy, the claw or the hoof completely surrounds Which bone?
Cuff.
Which is which bone? P3. But now it completely surrounds it. So that's why it's called a coffin bone, because it's inside the coffin of the hoof. Okay? The coffin bone is completely surrounded by bloody vascular tissue that has nerves in it, called the corium. So if you go through the hoof wall into the corium, it's going to bleed like a son of a gun and it's going to hurt. Then, when we look at the core or the unguis itself, it's divided into different areas. First, we have the toe portion that goes across, and it's usually the cranial-most aspect of the toe or the hoof. Okay? Then you have the quarters. Quarters are on either side, basically the biggest portion or the tallest portion of the hoof. And then the caudal portion that, as it comes around, is called the heel. If you ever pick up a horse foot and look underneath, you're going to see the sole, just like you saw on the dog. Okay? This time, though, it's completely surrounding the inside lining, or lines it, and right in the middle of this thing called the sole is a thing called the frog. Okay? Why they call it a frog, I don't know. I don't care. That's just what it is. Okay? But in equids or equines only, that's the only, because you don't see this in a cow, they don't have this. Okay? But if they're an equine, they do have the frog. The frog is a point of attachment between the hoof, heel, and the sole. And that's really important because it allows the hoof wall to expand every time they step down. And you'll see why that's so important a little later. Okay? When we look at that hoof, think about it. If you were walking on your middle toe and your toenail was constantly hitting the ground every time you took a step, what would happen within a short time? You're going to knock it off. It's going to break off. Well, how come it doesn't do that with a horse? Why don't their hooves come off? Because that's a lot of weight. A quarter horse, 1,200 pounds, constantly, every time it takes a step. Why doesn't that knock the hoof off the corium? It has to do with how it's attached. It's attached through this thing called the wall. The coronary band, or the cells that are producing the keratinized cell, are way up inside here, okay? Way up in here, okay? That coronary band is sometimes called a groove if you're looking at the hoof portion. If you're looking at the live portion, that's the coronary band. That part of a horse foot is critical for the production of the hoof. If this area up in here gets damaged severely, that can destroy the hoof. Okay? And that's really a bad thing for a horse. When you look at this hoof wall, what do you see in here? What does that look like? Huh? Nope. Those are tubes. And that's the end of the tubes. They're open. Why is that? Physics. This hoof wall with these tiny little tubes going down it is stronger than if it was completely solid. So now it's a stronger construction because of physics. Okay? In between all of those tiny little tubes that you can see going down there, it's called the intertubular horn. Horn. That should be a hint for something that's coming later. Okay? Now, the closer we get to the bloody layer or the corium, that hoof starts to become lamellated or layers. Okay? Those tiny little layers are called the lamina. Okay? The lamina of the hoof interdigitate with the lamina of the corium. So here's the hoof out here with its lamina going in. Here's the corium with its lamina going up. And they interdigitate. Okay? Well, your fingernails and the dogs, they do the same thing. They interdigitate. But when you start looking really, really closely at those lamina, they're completely different. Okay? That lamina, if it's coming from the corium side, has nerves in it. So that means it is called the sensitive lamina, because it's got blood and it's got nerves in it. The side that's on the other part, or the hoof part, is insensitive lamina, because it's just dead cells. Okay? Now, this right here is just one of these things here. Okay? So when you look at this right here, that one layer right there, that's this right here. And now look at it. Each one of those layers, or lamina, has thousands of other ones going the other direction. And the sensitive lamina, which would be here, interdigitates in there as well. Everybody see how that works? So now you can see how that hoof stays on there. Because the surface area for connection between the horse insensitive lamina and the sensitive lamina is phenomenal. That amount of surface area is why that horse hoof can stay on that hoof or on that foot, so he can walk on it, unless something bad happens. The corium, remember, is here, the sensitive lamina, and it has blood and nerve. What would you call it if that got inflamed? Laminitis. If that gets really severe, then this interdigitation starts to break down. And now all of a sudden the corium and the hoof start to separate. And what does the corium surround? The coffin bone. So the coffin bone actually starts to rotate. And then they step on it. And the coffin bone is what? Right in the front. Pointed. Now it's pointing down. Every time he steps on it, what's going to happen? He's going to drive that P3 right through the bottom of his foot, right through the sole. And that's what founder is. That's what laminitis can do. It can cause separation of P3 from the hoof, and that can be devastating to the horse. It's one of the primary reasons that they say no hoof, no horse. That's how important that is, okay? Now let's get to this frog thing. The frog thing is very, very elastic tissue. Deep to the frog, between the frog and the bones, there's a big pad in there, a big cushion type pad. That's called the digital cushion. Now remember I said that the frog is kind of a point of attachment between the sole and the hoof wall, okay? Every time this horse steps down, because that hoof wall is strong, it's also somewhat flexible, the hoof spreads out, okay? As it spreads out, then the hoof, or the frog, kind of flattens out. When the horse picks his foot up, the hoof comes back. That's really important, because that action, that compression on the walls and the cartilage and the ground is what pumps blood out of the feet. Because the heart is not strong enough to pump blood from the heart all the way down to the foot, and then have the blood push the blood back out into the veins. So the horse has to step down. Every time he steps down, the hoof expands. When he picks up, it comes back, and that pumps the blood up the leg. Okay? This is why motion in the horse is so critical. They have to be walking around. If the horse doesn't walk around, their blood starts to back up in their feet. And the blood has plasma in there, and that fluid starts to leak out. And if a horse doesn't move around, they get edema in their legs. It's called stocking up. You ever wonder why, when you guys went out to the equine lab, you learned how to wrap the legs? To decrease stocking up when they're standing still so long. because they have to move to make sure that that gets out. If a horse just stays in a paddock all the time, okay, it's not going to be able to walk around very well because its legs are going to get really fat and full of edema. Okay? Now, obviously, these aren't still growing. They constantly grow. So they have to be trimmed on a regular basis. If they're walking on hard ground, then it might wear some down, but they still have to be trimmed out. So you call a specialist for trimming horse hooves. That's called a farrier. I'm a veterinarian, but I'm not a farrier. I'm going to call somebody that knows how to do this, that knows how to do a toenail trim, if you will, on a horse. The way they trim it, the way they shoe the horse, is going to tell how well that horse is going to be able to respond, especially if there's been something like laminitis. All right. That gets us to 11 o'clock, so we should be done, right?